Okay, we're going to begin with the word of prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we invite your Spirit's presence as we open your word, as we look at difficult passages of Scripture, ones in which there is much controversy. And Lord, we need your guidance. We know we are human. We have only a very partial understanding of anything. And the amount of information that we have to process is greater than our minds could comprehend. But we pray, Lord, through your Holy Spirit, that you can enlighten our minds, that you can guide us on the correct path and understanding of these things. And we ask this, Lord, not for intellectual knowledge, but for spiritual strength and understanding, that we can reflect your character. Help us to understand these things for that purpose. And we pray this for each person. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, good morning, everyone. So yesterday, as we were reading through Jeff's paper or article from the May 1996, Our Firm Foundation magazine, we came into a discussion regarding, and we've been discussing this, Uriah Smith's interpretation of Daniel chapter 11, verse 40. One is we see that there's this contrast or differences that exist, and we need to resolve those things. So we need to resolve these various issues. And I'm having trouble with my PDF reader. Okay. That's terrible. Okay, I'm going to close this if I can. Okay. So I'm looking for, so I found, you can find it on the internet. You can find it in E.G. White disc. We're gonna look at Josiah Litch's understanding of Daniel chapter 11. Now, Dwight has done some work as well, and so I don't think we're going to get through everything here today that we need to. But just to sort of review, in May 1996, as we were dealing with the issues of the French Revolution, we came to understand that there was a problem in understanding how atheism moved from France to Russia. And that is, I don't know how to put it in a simple way. But when you read Ellen White, and she talks about, in this passage from Education 228, this is sort of where we left off, the centralizing of wealth and power, the vast combinations for the enriching of the few at the expense of the many, the combinations of the poor classes for the defense of their interests and claims, the spirit of unrest, of riot and bloodshed, and the worldwide dissemination of the same teachings that led to the French Revolution, all are tending to involve the whole world in a struggle similar to that which convulsed France. Now, the way that Jeff would have understood this is the rise of the USSR. Now, in trying to relate how we have understood the events, the current events, and how Jeff would have understood them in 1996, we run into a parallel with the history that occurred in the Millerite movement. That is, again, it's one of perspective or magnification, looking at where you are in the stream of time and believing that you're further along than you actually are. And in 1996, Jeff was looking for the Sunday law. He wasn't looking for August 11th, 1840 to be repeated in the future, because he had seen a parallel of that with the fall of the Soviet Union. So there's a number of little details that that have to be addressed. And we understand that Daniel 11, verse 40, has spans history from 1798 to 1989. So we know there's this span of time. Daniel 1140a, 1798, Daniel 1140b is 1989. These two times of the end. And the understanding of the time of the end in Millerite history is 1798. They understood that to be the time of the end. It's the end of the 1260 years. But there's some complexity regarding that. And that complexity has to do with how we apply the time of the end in Daniel chapter 11 now compared to how the Millerites understood it. So the Millerites had a different interpretation of Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45. And you can see why they would have had to, because they believed that Jesus is coming back in 1843. So they wouldn't be looking at a repeated time of the end. They would look at everything happening in their time. Now, there's something that's happened in Adventism that we have to be very, very cautious about. And this would come from an understanding of how we interpret prophecy and what happened to Adventism in the 1900s, and particularly the interpretation of the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation, but the book of Daniel specifically relating to Daniel chapter 8. And that happened at the beginning of the 1900s, and it progressed by this understanding of the daily being Christ's heavenly ministry. So as you can see, when we start to look at this problem, it's not a simple problem. It's not one where we just look at a few verses and look at some interpretation. All of these things are tied together. So the understanding of the daily, the understanding of how the time of the end works, the understanding of the close of probation and how it's related to the time of the end, the understanding of the fall of the Ottoman Empire and how the Millerites understood it as being connected to the close of probation. So right now, where we started looking at the interpretation of Daniel 11, verse 40, dealing with what happened in 1989, because that's what this article is on in the May 1996 Our Firm Foundation. It's addressing that change. But as we looked at that, we started to realize that there were some problems because of the perspective where Jeff is in 1996 and where we are now in 2021. The question is, what is it that he understood correctly? And what things did he miss because of perspective? And the things that he got correctly, which are part of the foundation of this message, we have to examine them. And we're going to see that they were laid correctly. And we're going to understand that they were laid correctly by looking at Millerite history. But it's going to be a bit of a journey that we have to go through as I've gone through this myself, looking at things, re-examining things, and noticing details that I never noticed before. And we've been noticing details in this movement as we've examined Millerite history. And I think this is one where we have to go back and be careful. Now, I say that because what happened with Desmond Ford is that he took an interpretation that Antiochus Epiphanes is the correct understanding of the little horn power. And that in order for us to apply it at the end, we would then have to understand that it was applied locally and literally to Antiochus Epiphanes, but that we're actually making a spiritual application at the end of the world. And that changes things quite a bit, so much so it really unravels Adventism, which Desmond Ford knew. And then we have, even in this movement, we had Parminder introduce the same idea. Now, what we have to be careful about then is, are we going to do the same thing? And I think that that's where some people are going to go when they start to re-examine, by some people who have abandoned July 18th, they're going to go back and make some of the same mistakes that were made by Desmond Ford and that were made by Parminder, and that are not going to be made by us. And that's because we're going to understand this correctly. That is, we're going to go back and see that that just because somebody sees something a certain way from perspective doesn't mean that you go back and you take that position. So we're going to leave this paper for a moment, maybe a couple of days, and we're going to look at some other things. So the thing that I want to look at is this article, which wouldn't open for me. So I might have to look at it in, I like looking at the original book, even though it's in a PDF rather than what's on the Ellen G. White disc. So I can't remember what page I was on. I think it was, yeah, it's here. Yeah. So what you're going to see happen is kind of interesting, because they're going to look at the French Revolution as part of what Daniel 11 at the end is about. So let me see if I can. Oh, see, I have this problem when I try to zoom in. Not sure. Oh, that's because there's a picture. Doesn't want me to look at that. Okay, I'm going to have to go to the E.G. White disc to look at this properly. So. Okay, so this article is Josiah Litch's Prophetic Expositions, Volume 2, and it's going to start way over here. It's going to deal with the Roman League, Battle of Actium, destruction of Jerusalem. I just got to see these. Yeah, so they're not going to have problems with the abomination of desolation. Now, this probably isn't big enough for people to see. So I'm going to have to zoom in. Oh. So when they're looking at Daniel 11, you're looking through verse 30 to 35. All of these things are not going to be a problem as far as our understanding that this is addressing Rome and the papacy. The change is going to come here with verse 36 of Daniel 11. So I'm just going to start reading here. We're going to go through this, and Dwight's going to have some things to add as time goes on here. That an event of such magnitude as the French Revolution, and coming as it does within the range of the great leading events of prophecy, the history of the four great governments of the earth should receive no notice in the prophecy, is not to be credited. And if it is to receive notice anywhere, what more likely place to find it in this most singularly definite and particular prediction of the 11th chapter of Daniel? And where in this chapter, except in the decline and before the overthrow of popery? In short, wherein but the very place in which we find the following exact description of a government perfectly answering the history of the Revolution of France. So this view here that Uriah Smith has in Daniel and Revelation is clearly expressed here by Litch. And then we have to understand, why is Litch's interpretation wrong? Why is Uriah Smith's interpretation wrong? Why did they get it wrong? And why do we have it right? The king shall do according to his will, and he shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god it should be, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished. For that is determined shall be done. Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any God, for he shall magnify himself above all. Such a system, as is here described, was the French Revolution. So this is definitely not the view that we take. Even though we recognize France is the one that brings the deadly wound, we don't see in Daniel 11 the French Revolution being described in this verse. We see the papacy being described. And we're going to have to try to explain why. It was founded in atheism and triumphed in the overthrow of everything which interposed a barrier to their object. The seed of this revolution were sown by Voltaire, the noted French infidel, who in early youth vowed to dedicate his life to the extermination of Christianity. He used to say, I am weary of hearing people repeat that 12 men established the Christian religion. I will prove that one man may suffice to overthrow it. To accomplish his object, he associated himself with a band of philosophic infidels, such as Rousseau, d'Alembert, Diderot, and others. Their numbers rapidly increased, and their success was beyond measure. In speaking of Christ, one of the watchwords of the fraternity was crush the wretch. They held the following language and sentiments. The fear of God is so far from being the beginning of wisdom that it is the beginning of folly. Modesty is only an invention of refined voluptuousness. So this is kind of the situation. The supreme king, the God of the Jews and the Christians, is but a phantom. Jesus Christ is an impostor. So these are the kinds of views that we see in the French Revolution. So what Litch is trying to say is that this is describing atheism, which is correct, but that's what's being described in what we take as a description of the man of sin. With millions of Frenchmen imbued with this spirit and sentiments like these as the materials for revolution, the engine was first brought to bear on the French government in 1789. The first blow was struck by the capture and destruction of the Bastille. In 1790, all the spiritual orders and cloisters were suppressed, and also the parliaments were suppressed soon afterward. Next followed the abolition of all the titles of the nobility, coats of arms, and decorations of the orders of chivalry. That was in June 19th, 1790. In 1792, France became a republic, and on the 26th of August in 1792, an open profession of atheism was made by the National Convention. The Reign of Terror then commenced in earnest, and the most horrid scenes were constantly occurring. On the 21st of January, 1793, the King of France was beheaded, and the Queen shared the same fate on the 1st of October of the same year. At this juncture, all religious worship was prohibited, save of liberty and the country. It was thus the government magnified itself above every god and spoke marvelous things against the God of gods, and did not regard any god. I do not know that I can, in a few words, give the reader a more full idea of the reign of atheism than by an extract from Smith's Key to the Revelation. And so he's going to talk here about all the different things that happened, and I don't think we need to read them. And then, nor the desire of woman is the abolition of marriage, is how they look at it, which doesn't really make much sense to me, because doesn't mean that they didn't have the desire of women. So obviously, it would be quite the opposite in some ways. But in his state shall he honor the God of forces, the God whom his fathers knew not, shall he honor with gold, silver, and with precious stones. So verse 38, the honoring of the God of forces, they're going to take liberty in the country where the objects of adoration. So they're going to interpret it that way. And a God whom his fathers knew not, the goddess of reason, is how they're going to interpret that. So any comments on this so far? because we
It
should
kind of works, but not really.
right. So it kind of works, and you can see why they would see that in the 1840s, right? This is recent history to them. The French Revolution is in the living memory of many of these people, the older ones, and of course the results afterward, and Napoleon would be, very recent history. And so,
And,
yeah.
and obviously, in their eyes, the papacy is ancient history. It's not coming back.
Yes, and this is an important point.
We've
Because-
always, sorry.
Okay, you didn't have anything to say, Jeff?
Yeah, I was just going to say we've always established that Rome establishes the vision, in this movement.
Yeah, and I would say that one of the problems that Adventism had is that Ellen White's view about the rise of the papacy didn't really make sense to many people. They couldn't see that. So to see the events of what was happening around them, the papacy is dead, was much more attractive, much more sensible, and an easier thing to present to others than the rise of the papacy. The papacy being put on the throne of the earth again, I think is something that Ellen White, through God's leading, through the Holy Spirit, through her visions, was presenting to Adventism, but I don't think it was a very attractive idea. And we have a hard time understanding that from our perspective now with the way that the papacy has arisen. So if you look at Lewis F. Weir and you look at what he was fighting against, and even if you look at what was happening within evangelical Adventism or different views that were forming, you could see now that Adventism really rejects the idea that the papacy is the danger that it once was. And this goes back, there's a long history behind it. So I think part of the problem is we have, as Seventh-day Adventists, we haven't really appreciated how our view has had to struggle through the years, because we're so close to that view that the papacy is going to rise again. But it wouldn't be a common view held by people in Ellen White's day. They would see that the papacy is dead. It would be to be in the situation we are right now, with the type of government we have, with the Constitution being ignored in the way that it is, free speech being stifled, all these different things that are happening. It would have been really hard for an American to imagine this sort of situation, thinking back, 150, 170, 180 years ago. They just wouldn't have seen this as a possibility. So you can see why they would interpret things that the way they do. They're going to look at the current events. So they're going to focus on this denial of God, the abolition of marriage, the system of heathenism, the religion of France, and then they're going to look at, and I'd like to read all of this, but would take a lot of time, and I don't think it's necessary. But then they're going to have verse 40, and I wanted to go back though before we get here, because they're going to look at Napoleon as in that history, but there was another point that I passed. Oh yes, here it is. In verse 35, where it says, "And some of them of understanding shall fall, to try them and to purge and to make them white, even to the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed." The way that they interpreted this verse is, as you're dealing with the papacy, you have this time of the end that's going to come. And this, they would look at verse 36 and so on as this French Revolution that's going to precede the time of the end. So they're looking at the persecution that's happening under the papacy in the preceding verses, when you go from 34 to 35. And then they see this reference to the time of the end, because it's still going to be in the future. And then they take verse 36 and they set up this willful king. And it says, and the king shall do according to his will. And in one of the versions of this article, there's a footnote. When it says the king, there's a footnote and says that it should be a king, that the definite article should be dropped. And of course, that's not the case, because in the Hebrew, the definite article is there. So we're taking in verse 36 when it says, the king shall do according to his will, this willful king. We're saying that this is the papacy. And because the language is the language of the papacy, it's not the language of as they're trying to make it, of France, because then you would have to take the other visions, Daniel 7, Daniel 8, and you would have to say, well, the king there would be France, because it's describing the same king. And we looked at Ellen White's statements, Jeff did, where you can see that Ellen White applies this verse to the papacy, not to France, okay? But can we see why? I mean, Ryan stated we can see why they would see it this way. But can we recognize why they shouldn't have seen it this way? I mean, besides what I've said, what is the problem that they're facing as they're interpreting these verses? I don't know if that's the best way to ask the question, because there are lots of problems.
Kind of black and white. I would say they're rejecting Ellen White's testimony.
Okay, well, yeah, but if you're dealing with Josiah Litch, this would be before Ellen White. So you're dealing with something written in 1840, 1841. And
I was thinking of you, Smith.
yeah, but if you're going to go back to Josiah Litch, what is the problem? And we're going to see it more clearly as we get into 40 to 45.
I don't know if this is the answer you're looking for, but and we've already said this, but they're looking for an immediate fulfillment, and so they're not looking into the future at all.
So they're looking for an immediate fulfillment, but what kind of fulfillment are they looking for?
Literal.
They're looking for a literal fulfillment, dealing with the king of the north and the king of the south. And see, this is an interesting point, is that when we go through Daniel chapter 11, and we have these battles between the king of the north and the king of the south, and then we have Rome. And where do we have the transition from pagan Rome to papal Rome? In Daniel 11, where does it give us that?
That had already happened much earlier in Daniel 11.
Well, yeah, and in Daniel 11, you can take verse 31, where the daily is taken out of the way and the abomination of desolation is set up, right? So, and part of the problem here is when you go back, we're gonna look at Daniel 11 and try to nail this down a bit more.
You can forgive them for wanting to be literal, because in 1798, the papacy received a literal deadly wound.
Well, no, but it didn't receive a literal deadly wound. It received a symbolic deadly wound. I mean, the Pope didn't get killed, right? So when you're dealing with symbols, they're mixing literal and spiritual. That is, they're not addressing how the prophecy has changed based upon what happened at the cross. So when we're going to be dealing with, if you go back, you're going to be dealing with, in Daniel 11, you're going to be dealing with the history of Rome. And so in Daniel 11:28, it says, "Then shall he return into his land with great riches. And his heart shall be against the holy covenant, and he shall do exploits and return to his own land." Who is this referring to? Daniel 11:28. Anybody?
It's referring to Rome pagan.
Yeah, it's pagan Rome. And what are they going to do? They're going to overthrow Egypt, and they're going to have an expedition against Judea, and they are going to capture. So this is, okay, so I'm going to read here. This is Uriah Smith. There's two returnings from foreign conquest are here brought to view. The first was after the events narrated in 26 and 27. And the second after the power had indignation against the Holy Covenant and had performed exploits. The first was fulfilled in the return of Augustus after his expedition against Egypt and Antony. He arrived in Rome with abundant honor and riches, for at this time such vast riches were brought to Rome from Egypt on the reducing of that country and on the return of Octavius Augustus and his army from thence. And Augustus celebrated his victories in a 3-day triumph. So we had studied this before when we had gone through Daniel chapter 11. The next great enterprise of the Romans after the overthrow of Egypt was the expedition against Judea and the capture and destruction of Jerusalem. The Holy Covenant is doubtless the covenant which God had maintained with his people under different forms in different ages of the world. The Jews rejected Christ, and according to the prophecy, that all who would not hear that prophet should be cut off. So it's going to talk about under Vespasian, the Romans invaded Judea, took the cities of Galilee, Chorazin, Bethsaida, Capernaum, where Christ had been rejected. So, and then it's going to talk about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. So that's the way that Uriah Smith interprets this. And then you're going to have, at the time appointed, he shall return and come toward the south, but it shall not be as the former or as at the latter. So what's the time appointed referred to here?
The moving
330.
of the capital.
Okay, I had two different, 330 AD. And what was the other thing someone said?
I said it was the moving of the capital.
Oh, the moving of the capital in 330. Okay.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And how do we know that? Why do we have the time appointed is the moving of the capital? What was the reason for that?
The grieving of the Roman state because of the barbarians.
Okay, so now what we're going to see is we're going to see
He
that,
moved the capital east.
right. So we're going to see all these things happening that are dealing with the fall of the Roman Empire. So Rome comes against God's people, but what's going to happen is Rome is going to gradually be destroyed. And where's the one even for a time? Where's that verse that talks about even for a time?
Verse 24.
Okay, so that was verse 24. Yeah. So when you go back to verse 24, and it says he shall forecast his devices against the strongholds, even for a time. When you get to, and the time appointed he shall return, that's where we're ending that time, correct? So we're going from the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, and we're going to then go to 330 AD, and that's going to be 360 years. Does that make sense to people? That's the time appointed. That was just in verse 24.
Right.
Okay. And then we're going to deal with a lot of this history, which has to do under the seven trumpets with the fall of Rome. And then in verse 31, an arm shall stand on his part. And on whose part is it that is referred to here?
The papacy.
Okay. So where is the papacy introduced? Where do we find it when it says the arm shall stand on his part? Where is the his?
He's introduced in verse 31, as far as I'm aware. He's not, because he's not in verse 30.
So he's not in verse 30. So is he in verse? So he's just introduced as a his. Is that what we're saying?
Well, I don't know.
Okay.
We look to the antecedent in verse 30.
Okay, so we know that arms shall stand on his part. Now, when it says he shall return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant, so the next verse, verse 30, Rome is pillaged by the barbarians. There's all this stuff that happens. So this is dealing with the emperor of Rome, right? And the emperors of Rome, the eastern division of which still continued, had intelligence or connived with the church of Rome. So I would say that this intelligence is this connection between the church and the state. So who is it that forsakes the Holy Covenant?
That's the Catholic Church.
The Catholic Church. So that's the his, right? So in verse 31, have intelligence with them that forsake the Holy Covenant. And then it says, an arm shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength. So the his actually refers to those ones that forsake the Holy Covenant, even though it says them in the plural, and it's now in the singular. Those that forsake the Holy Covenant are a part of the Catholic Church. But when it says arm shall stand on his part, this is referring to the papacy itself. And they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily. So the sanctuary of strength is Rome, and the taking away of the daily is the removal of paganism, right? And it's going to be replaced, and they shall place the abomination.
Right.
It's desolate. Okay. So that's our understanding. That's the Millerite understanding. That's Jeff's understanding. That's the pioneer's understanding of the daily. And such as do wickedly against the covenant shall be corrupt by flatteries. But the people that do know their God shall be strong and do. And they that understand among the people shall instruct many. Yet they shall fall by the sword, by flame, by captivity, and by spoil. So this is talking about the persecutions that are going to happen under the 1260 years. But now when they shall fall, they shall be holpen with a little help, but many shall cleave to them with flatteries. So this is the compromises that happen, and also the protection that God gives. And some of them of understanding shall fall, to try them, to purge them, to make them white, even to the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed. So the way that they're looking at this is this is the end of the 1260 years. And what does this verse remind us of in Revelation? To try them, to purge them, to make them white. At least
Revelation 12:10.
Okay. So if we go to Revelation 12:10, I don't think that's the one I'm looking at, but Revelation 12:10 addresses the end of things. So I wouldn't put it there. I mean, you have the overcome by the blood of the Lamb. I would go to I'm not sure. I always forget where to find this one. No, that's not where I want to be. Is it here? It's Revelation 6:9. Now this is the fifth seal. And when he had opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar souls of them that were slain for the word of God and for the testimony which they held. And they cried with a loud voice, saying, How long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not judge and avenge our blood on them that dwell on the earth? And white robes were given to every one of them, and it was said unto them that they should rest yet for a little season, until their fellow servants also and their brethren that should be killed, as they were, should be fulfilled. So what is this fifth seal? What is this talking about? The sixth seal, or fifth seal, pardon me.
A cry for justice.
Okay, and when does it occur? When is the time of the fifth seal?
Justice.
Yeah. So when is the time of the fifth seal?
1798.
Okay. So when's the fourth seal? What's the history of the fourth seal? I know we're just jumping into the seals.
The 1260 years.
Okay. Yeah, so we're going to look at this the period from 538. And so the fifth seal would happen at the end of that period, correct? So it's at the end of the 1260 that you're going to have the fifth seal opened. And the cry of how long? And how long, what's the how long in reference to? Where do we get these how longs? Why the question of the how long?
The how long question is always about the Sunday law.
Okay. I wouldn't.
That's what I was thinking too. That's
I
our
wouldn't-
stock answer.
Yeah, see, I wouldn't agree with that. I mean, it is in another application of it, but it's always about a time period that is being looked for to end that a person is in. That is, you don't ask how long, at least your kids don't when you're on a holiday, until you're on the trip. You don't ask how long before the trip begins. So you're in a situation of persecution, and now you ask how long. So what other how longs do we have that we can think of that would relate to this how long? Not exactly to the same period.
I'm thinking Zechariah chapter 1. I think it's verse 12.
Okay, so Zechariah chapter 1, verse 12. Yep. How long wilt thou not have mercy on
I
Jerusalem
was
and
thinking
Judah, against which we had indignation these 70 years? So this is near the end of the 70 years of the desolation of the temple. They asked the question, how long? Okay, someone else? Was that Pat?
I was looking at Isaiah 6:11. Then said I, how long? And he answered, until the cities be wasted without inhabitant. How long he was to prophesy.
Okay, so he's asking how long. Is that what he's asking? Is he really asking how long he's going to prophesy? Is that what the how long is about?
Or how long before the nation's destroyed.
Yeah, I would think that's more the question, not about his prophesying. because he knows that there's going to be a judgment being brought. And that's what he wants to know, about a judgment being brought. Now, in the book of Daniel, we have two how longs that I know of. Daniel 8. This is the one I thought everybody would just, go to this one. How long shall be the vision concerning the daily and the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden underfoot? So why is this question of how long pertinent to that how long in chapter 6, verse 9 of Revelation?
The persecution of the daily.
Okay, it's about the
Rome.
daily, yeah, and also the transgression of desolation. So in Daniel 8, there's a question asked regarding two different periods, the daily and the transgression of desolation. In Daniel chapter 12, we also have it how long? How long shall it be to the end of these wonders in 12 verse 6? And that this is referring to the first part, the daily, for a time, times and a half, and when he shall have accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people. So that time, times and a half is not the time, times and a half of the transgression of desolation. It's the time, times and a half of the daily that's being answered or being asked and answered in 12 verse 6 and 7. And then in Revelation 6, 9, it's talking about the end of the 1260 years of the papacy. But in Daniel 8, it addresses both of those periods together. So Daniel 8 is addressing the 2520. And there's more to it than that, because it's also attaching the 2300 days to that in answer to it. So the 2300 days is an answer to the question, how long shall be the 1260 years of the daily and the 1260 years of the papacy? Does that make sense what I'm saying here? And anybody have any questions about it? Because this is something I've studied a long time ago, the how longs, and in this message. So it's been an important point for me. So now when you get to this, Daniel 11:35, and some of them of understanding shall fall, to try them and to purge them and to make them white, even to the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed. Remember, we just had an appointed time, right? So remember that we had 360 years, and that 360 years, what was it for again?
Pagan Rome.
Okay, it was for pagan Rome, for the city, right? The fortress. Right, the city of Rome, that's going to have this period of time, because they're going to, from the strongholds, from the forecasted devices against the strongholds, even for a time. And so we're going to have that 360 years, and then at the time appointed he shall return, come toward the south, but it shall not be as the former or as the latter, right? And then we're going to have the history
Angela
of all of Rome. What's that? Okay, so
Angela made a note.
Okay, Angela made a note. So Revelation 12:17 and Psalm 79:10-13. Yeah, so I don't think that answers this question. I think I understand what she's saying, but I think that this is just referring to the period of the persecution at the end of the 1260 years, which is the main point here. And so when it says, arms shall stand on his part, this is going to be with the setting up of the papacy, the taking away of the daily and the setting up and placing of the abomination that maketh desolate. And then we have, we're going to have the persecution that happens at the end of that. And then it says that at the end of that time is going to be even the time of the end, but because it is yet for a time appointed. So I want us to understand how they saw this. And because now what they're going to do is in verse 36, they're going to bring us to the end and they're going to say, well, this is the French Revolution. And there's a lot of logic to it. But one is they have to say that it says a king shall do according to his will, not the king. And since it's the topic of all this previous part has to do with the setting of the papacy, the one who's going to do according to his will is the papacy. He shall exalt himself, magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods. So instead of going to the end of the end of the 1260 here, what they're going to do is they're going to go back and explain the characteristic of this persecuting power. And then they're going to come to its end, right? Because it is yet for a time appointed. So the context of here is not the events at the time of the end, but the characteristic of this power for this 1260 years. That is, it's describing the abomination of desolation that has been set up. It's not describing France. And I understand you could try to take some of this and apply it to atheism, but we saw that Ellen White applies this to the papacy. And we could also see when we looked at the other prophecies of Daniel, the one that exalts himself and magnifies himself is the man of sin, the papacy. But let's look at how they understand it. So they say, a king shall do according to his will. He shall exalt himself, magnify himself above every god. Now, when they say a king, who is the king then in their understanding?
Turkey.
No, they have it as France, right? So they're going to say it's France. So who is a king here if it's France?
Napoleon.
Okay, so this could be Napoleon. So it's the king of France. Now, to try to understand this as Napoleon, they have to take all of France. They kind of have to give some of these attributes of Napoleon or of France to Napoleon, which don't always apply. But because when it's talking here about a king, it says, neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women. So sometimes they're attributing this to Napoleon, and sometimes they're going to attribute it just to France itself, which to me seems inconsistent. Now, we said that the problem is that they're dealing with this literally. Now, the question that I have is, when do we make the transition from literal to spiritual in our understanding of things? Where do we place that? What event marks the transition from earthly to heavenly, literal to spiritual?
The cross.
The cross. Where in Daniel 11 does the transition from literal to spiritual, earthly to heavenly occur?
In 538.
Yes. And why? Why should we take 538 and now use it as a parallel to the cross when it comes in regard to this history in Daniel 11?
Well, because there's a line called the line of Christ that you can do.
Yeah.
and and the line of the papacy that goes below it. And that shows that 538 is the papacy's cross. But I don't really know how to explain this very well.
Well, I think you explained it well. So we line up 538 with the cross because of the two 1260s, right? The 3.5 years that Christ ministered on earth and the 3.5 years of heaven to the close of probation in 34 AD. And now we're going to do the same thing with the 1260, the two 1260s. We're going to have a 2520, and I call it the counterfeit covenant week, right? It's the satanic covenant week. So just as we go from literal to spiritual at the cross, the same thing happens when it comes to these prophecies dealing with Rome. Does that make sense? To anybody have a comment on that? Does that make sense? Or does it not make sense?
Well, okay, let's look at this in a different way as well.
Okay.
With pagan Rome, you have a situation where pagan Rome stood up against Christ.
Mm-hmm.
By 538, you have a situation where the papacy is standing up against Christ as well, because they don't seek to honor Christ, they seek to honor themselves.
Right, which is verse 36.
Exactly.
And if the Millerites had been consistent, they would have seen this, but they didn't see it. They should have seen what it was describing. But instead, they tried to apply it to friends. But then that really ignores the whole idea of the two desolating powers. Everything that they had set up in their understanding of the two desolating powers and the daily, they seem to ignore its parallel to the week of Christ.
Hi guys.
Hi, Mark.
Hi guys. This is so terrible city. Make me to laugh. Yes, play like a song in my ears.
Okay. Well, Mark,
Yeah.
is this related to what we're talking about, Mark?
I know. Just calm down, Theo James Tuna. I know. Let me to start. Let me start. I to say first.
Okay.
That is city. Maybe laugh. You play that song in my ears. I do understand.
Okay.
Of Rome not understanding of the Christ did of someone. Yes, right there. You're not jealous. And seventh day, Rome not allowed Jesus do in one day till his Rome not allowed Jesus do he one do for his father till he come again his second returned.
Okay.
Back in this oath, not let him do it. They did kill him front of his kind of people.
Okay. Thanks, Mark. So we can see we have this parallel. the death of Christ divides this week, the 70th week, between earthly and heavenly, and that the satanic covenant is doing the same thing. So what does this, how would this change our understanding of interpreting the events that occur under the papacy? After you have the papacy set on the throne of the earth, what are the events then? How should we interpret them?
The point that I had looked to make.
Yeah.
The situation under pagan Rome allows then for us to see the situation under papal Rome being a further repeat and enlargement of what had gone on in the first period.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as we have noted in the past, the Miller was very supportive of the 7 times that ended in 1844, but was not entirely addressing the 7 times that ended in 1798.
Correct. He kind of addresses it, but not completely.
Right. So the concept of the repeat and enlarge that we have under the 7 times that ends in 1798 was not fully addressed in their time.
Right. Yeah. And so they're not going to see that they need to apply things differently. So they're looking at things more literally, because Daniel 11 is fairly literal in its description of history, but not when it gets to the papacy. Correct?
Correct.
And that point is missed. So it's kind of understandable. Again, they're going to be looking at this in this way. Now, when it comes to the king of the north and the king of the south, what do these primarily refer to? What's their initial application when you're dealing with the king of the north and the king of the south earlier? What are those addressing? Just a reminder.
The polemic and Seleucid empires.
Right. So it's a division of Greece. So
I see.
when we get to the king of the north and the king of the south at the end, what is it? How do we relate those back to the king of the north and the king of the south addressing Greece? Why can we do that? And how do we do that?
The spiritual has to have an antitype in the literal, or I mean a type in the literal.
Okay. But we have this king of the north and the king of the south, and all of a sudden we're going to apply them again at the end. But now it's not going to be Greece, right? And so to understand what that is, how did Lich, and you know, we're going to go through it. So I'm kind of going through and telling you before we actually read it in Lich. But we know it about in Uriah Smith. So what were they doing to try to identify the king of the north and the king of the south at the end of the world? Because you're going to have the king of the north and the king of the south mentioned way back in, you know, Daniel 11, verse 13, 14, 15. And then you're going to have, let me see here. And then you're going to have, you know, the papacy begin to rise, right? And Rome. So you're going to have, well, I guess Rome begin to rise is what it is. So you're going to have Rome rise in this history, but you have no mention of the king of the north and the king of the south. So you go all through Daniel 11. And then all of a sudden, in verse 40, you're going to have the king of the south mentioned. Now, does it mention the king of the north prior to mentioning the king of the south? Because in verse 40 it says, and at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him. Where is it last mentioned the king of the north?
Much earlier.
Yeah, okay, much earlier. So when it says the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, we know that Lich, he's going to say, well, the king of the south now is going to push at France, because he's going to set up that France is the king that shall do according to his will. But that's not consistent, because we've had a change. We've moved from literal to spiritual. So the king of the south, he's just going to say, is Egypt. But we're going to say no, because we're not in the history of ancient Greece. How much further are we along? Like we're 17, like it's over 2,000 years since we had the king of the north and the king of the south. So the question is, would this king of the south and this king of the north be Turkey and Egypt? Would that be logical? To all of a sudden introduce Turkey and Egypt after we've had all this history of Rome, and then they're going to introduce France as this atheistic power, and the power that's going to come against France is going to be this division of Greece. Does that make sense?
No.
No, it's totally inconsistent, right? With everything that they have done in prophetic interpretation. And yet, for some reason, and I would say that it would have been current events, is they see that Turkey and Egypt are in a war, and that's the big news of the day. Now, can we have a parallel to our history, not so much in this movement, but to things like Babylon and Egypt being used in this way within the last 30 years, where all of a sudden we look at Babylon, stuff happening in Iraq and stuff happening in Egypt as a fulfillment of prophecy, especially Daniel 11, verse 40. Have we seen that?
Yes, with evangelicals.
Yeah, evangelicals do this all the time, right? So
And even Adventists.
Yes, and I was going to
Yeah,
say,
Tim Rosenberg did it also.
right. So you see a bunch of Adventists do the same thing. All of a sudden, these symbols, which we are now not going to apply literally, we're going to apply in a symbolic way. We're not going to say that Babylon is Iraq. We're going to say that Babylon is the papacy, because that's how Revelation lays it out. And this change happens in Daniel chapter 11 as well. Now, so you can see why somebody would do it, but in so doing, they're actually contradicting their own rule. They shouldn't be seeing Egypt as a literal nation and Babylon, which is Turkey, as a literal nation coming to play in history. Now, the question that's going to come up, so as we're going to go back and look at some of these things probably a little bit more tomorrow. And Dwight, on your studies on all the references on the King of the North, just before we go on, is there anything that relates to what we're doing right now, or is this something that we're going to bring up later?
There's quite a bit for what we're dealing with. I looked at one set of articles that the Ellen White resources did not wish to name the author. I was surprised as to who the author was, but I'm now going to go back over some other points. So there's a couple more things that I'm looking at, and then I'll be able to share with everybody the different. Go ahead.
Okay, so you're talking about which article that they don't want to tell you who the author is?
out of the Bible Echo.
Okay. So there's an article in the Bible Echo, and E.G. White Estates won't tell you who the author is, or they don't know.
No, they just didn't place who the author was. There's several articles, some from Present Truth, United Kingdom, some from the General Conference Daily Bulletin, some from the Adventist Review and Sabbath Herald, where they just said, okay, you're going to find the article here, but they didn't wish to state who wrote the article.
Okay. Okay. So you're going to sort out that, try to figure that out or something?
Yeah, I'm going through it, and I'll have that. I should have it sorted here a little bit later today.
Okay. Yeah. So I know I'm sort of summing up kind of where we're going to dig into, but I want to go back to this article by Litch just briefly. I want to get some of this background here. So again, when we get to these verses, I'm just going to look over these verses that we had looked at. So when the king shall do according to his will, they're going to say a king. And they're going to describe this as the French Revolution. So I went through this already. They're going to look at these different characteristics: the denial of God, the adoration of the goddess of reason, the abolition of the marriage vow, which to me doesn't say that they don't have the desire of women. That would be kind of the opposite. And they even sort of say so themselves. And then this system of heathenism. So what is heathenism?
Paganism.
Yeah, it's just another word for paganism. Now, right, and they're going to say that a system of paganism was next introduced into France. So now, how is paganism related to atheism? Because wouldn't atheism be not paganism?
Egypt. They were pagans, but
Well,
Yeah.
I'm not sure if this is what you're looking for,
Egypt,
but
both pagan and atheistic.
Okay, Ryan. Yeah. What?
pagan gods are essentially just glorified humans. So maybe that's why, maybe that would be what you're talking about. I'm not sure.
Okay, so atheism and paganism are tied together. So we can see that with Egypt. But the question is why? Because wouldn't atheism just be no gods? Period. What's the problem there? Why does atheism tend towards paganism? And why would we call it paganism? Well,
I would say that they're sort of saying that we're gods. Is that what you're maybe thinking?
of what?
Humanism is basically saying that we are gods.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and you got to worship somebody, to quote Bob Dylan. It may be the devil, but it may be the Lord, right? And if it's not God, you are worshiping the devil. That is, I don't think that somebody can truly not worship something. If you're not worshiping God, you're worshiping man. And you're even scientism is a type of paganism. Because what is scientism a worship of?
Of human expertise.
Of human expertise and also nature. In scientism, in a lot of scientists, they capitalize universe. Why do they capitalize the word universe? Why would an evolutionist capitalize the word universe? Have you ever thought about that?
I wasn't aware of it, but I suppose it's making it giving a maybe like a personality.
Yeah, it's the where we come from, right? I mean, if you're an evolutionist and you're not worshiping a god, you don't believe that there is a god, you're a naturalist. You believe that everything that exists is just it just exists, and I'm the product of nature. In Canada, well, probably lots of other people know about David Suzuki. He's a Canadian scientist of sorts, but mostly he's a journalist. He took genetics when he was younger, but he's a prominent New Age figure, a scientific figure. He's definitely anti-Christian. He's definitely atheist. But he used to have a program, and I don't know if he still has it, on Canadian Broadcasting Corporation called The Nature of Things. But really, all the show was about, and I used to watch this when I was a kid. I always hated the show. I could never figure out why I hated it so much, because I like nature and animals and plants and things. But he's always dealing with the wonder of nature, the amazing miracles that nature produces. And so even though he professes to be an atheist, really he's worshiping nature. He's worshiping self. So paganism is really akin to atheism.
That's why they capitalize Mother Nature too.
Yes. Yeah.
Dawkins and Hawkins.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, people who are atheists don't realize how much they worship, and how much they're ideologues as well. But that's another point. So anyway, you have France. France is atheistic. Now it's going to take down. We know Napoleon's General Berthier is going to go in, and he's going to capture the Pope, and that's Pope Pius VI. Is that who it is? I can't always forget.
I think so.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah. Okay. So then you're going to have verse 40. So you're going to have Bonaparte, Napoleon. Verse 40, and at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships. And he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. At the time of the end. At the time of the end is the period first introduced in chapter 8, verse 16. Understand, O Son of Man, for at the time of the end shall be the vision. That is, at the time of the end, the vision shall be understood. Again, and I think that's partly correct, but I think there's more to it than that. It is introduced in verse 35 of the 11th chapter, where we are told that the persecution of the saints will continue in a measure to the time of the end. The French revolutionary government was then introduced to fill up the period to the time of the end. So that's how they're looking at it. They're seeing that the papacy is kind of being attacked during this French Revolution. So they're not looking necessarily, they're going to look at the close of this, but they're seeing that the French Revolution is filling up this end period of the 1260 years. The French Revolution, then it says, now in the 40th verse, again introduced, it is the period of the fall of the papal power. The period was 1798, when, as we will be seen by the extract which follows, the Pope's power was destroyed and he carried into captivity. So it's going to talk about this. Acts of violence were committed on the part of the French, first in Italy, where a numerous army stayed even after the conclusion of peace. They fell upon the Pope, whose defenseless situation invited to aggression. General Dufault, attached to the embassy of Joseph Bonaparte at Rome, lost his life in a popular tumult caused by the cries of Viva la République, long live the Republic, December 28th, 1797. The ambassador took his departure immediately, and General Berthier, who had succeeded Bonaparte at the command of the Italian army, entered Rome February 10th, 1798, where 5 days after the revolution was consummated. The papal government was abolished and the Roman Republic proclaimed. At the head of the government were placed 5 consuls, assisted by a senate and a tribunate. but they had contributions imposed upon the people by the French army, and the shameless pillage of treasures of art diminished the joy of the liberated. The Pope, although he had signed his abdication in relation to his temporal power, was nevertheless conveyed to France as a prisoner and treated with indignity. The aged man, he was 82, bore his sufferings with fortitude and died a prisoner in Valence on August 29th, 1799. So remember, that date is the date in 2019, so how many years later was that? August 29th, 2019. Stephen, what happened to you?
Yeah, that's 220 years later.
Yeah, so the spirit of the papacy was revived.
Yes.
And,
We were
and,
kind of big.
yeah, and how did it
recant.
happen? What happened?
Yeah, we were just in a meeting and we were told to basically don't mention these things without even giving us an explanation to sort of as to why. It's just basically recant was basically what they were saying.
Recant the teachings of Theodore Turner.
Yeah, it was just the studies of July 18 was connected with that there. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, and that I had manipulated you and stuff like that. That was sort of.
Yeah, so you were Simon Magus.
Yeah. I shouldn't laugh. I just think it's so funny sometimes that anybody would think I was Simon Magus. But yeah. So anyway, we have this history dealing with the captivity of the Pope and his ultimate death, right? So the king of the south shall push at him. At whom? The answer is, at the subject of prophecy in the preceding verses, the revolutionary government of France. So the power is clearly antecedent to him in this verse. And the king of the south, and who is the king of the south? The answer is given in the exposition of the first 6 verses of the chapter, which the reader can examine. It is clearly the government of Egypt. I do not know that there is a dissenting voice to the application of this term to Egypt in the former part of this chapter, nor can I see any good reason why there should be in the latter part, as long as it was literally fulfilled in Egypt. So you can see he's going to introduce this word literally fulfilled, but should they be looking for a literal fulfillment? The answer would be no, right? That is, what they are looking for, what they're looking for is they're looking for the wrong thing. And of course, they've misapplied this description of the papacy, the spirit of the papacy, which is clearly 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, Daniel chapter 7, Revelation 9, or Daniel chapter 8, pardon me. And they've now applied it to France, which doesn't make any sense in that sense. Now, did these things happen though? So did the king of the south push at France?
No.
No. Now, did France push at the king of the south? Did France, and I'm talking about Egypt. So did Egypt push at France? Is the question
No.
I guess I'm asking. No, they didn't. Right? Now, France came down to Egypt.
Yeah.
So we know about that, but that would be France pushing at Egypt, not Egypt pushing at France. Egypt doesn't try to invade France, but France does invade Egypt. So I kind of have a bit of a problem with it just in their literal interpretation of events. Because it's going to talk about France on May 20th, 1798, with a fleet of 13 ships of the line and 14 frigates and 400 transports. They carried 40,000 picked soldiers and officers. And on the 1st of July, they reached the coast of Egypt and landed the army about 1.5 miles from Alexandria. Now, when they say shall push, the weakness of this term is push a weak term in the Bible.
No, it's warfare.
It's warfare. So they're misinterpreting this passage push. So they're just saying, well, that was their ineffectual resistance. But that's not what push means. So how do we know that? Where is our example of push? Daniel 8, right?
Yeah, with the goat and the ram.
Right. And this has to do with conquering. So when the ram in verse 8 pushes westward, northward, and southward so that no beast might stand before him, do we use word pushing there as some kind of weak resistance? Obviously not, right? It's not.
No, it's a very strong.
Yeah. So so there's a problem there. So we have a misinterpretation of the history because we have a misinterpretation of the Hebrew itself, which we couldn't use other places that this word is used. We couldn't say that it's a weak, ineffectual resistance when it's actually an overpowering, a conquering. So the push by the king of the south has to be something that is akin to overcoming and conquering. So did France overcome and conquer the papacy? We would say yes. So the king of the south then has to be France. And it's, of course, a spiritually Egypt, right? It's not literally Egypt. And what's our basis for doing that? I mean, we have a good
Revelation
Bible.
11.
Yeah, so Revelation chapter 11. So Revelation chapter 11 tells you that France, which we would all agree when we're reading Revelation 11, and the pioneers would have understood that because they applied this to the French Revolution, that France is the one that's called Egypt, right? And that's spiritually called Sodom and Egypt. So if you have France being Egypt, but then you're going to take this king of the south and say it's Egypt and it's going to push against France. Well, France isn't pushing against itself. So you can see the problems that arise when they try to make this interpretation. So some interesting history. There's all really good things to read just to understand the history of it. Now, when they're going to deal with like a whirlwind, so they're going to deal with the response of the king of the north. The king of the north it is universally acknowledged, signifies in this chapter Syria as being the northern division of the empire of Alexander the Great. So again, they're going to take this old history of a kingdom that's gone, that's moved out of Bible prophecy because Rome has replaced it. And now they're going to introduce it again in a literal way so obviously this has to do with Syria. So now it says that France is going to push at Egypt or come against Egypt, but it doesn't say that. They're just going to say Egypt pushed feebly and ineffectually resisted the invasion, which is not what the verse would be saying at all. And then they're going to have like a whirlwind, the king of the north, it is universally acknowledged as Syria. This says, having established his authority in Egypt, Bonaparte commenced early in 1797 another campaign. It was his design to march his army by land to the British East Indies with an army of 10,000 picked men. He left Egypt, took the fortress of El Arish on February 15th, and pursuing his march, took Gaza without opposition. He next stormed Jaffa, the Joppa of the Bible, and after a desperate resistance, the city and the garrison surrendered. 3,000 Turks were killed in the siege, and from 1,200 to 3,000 more who surrendered themselves as prisoners of war were led out into the field unarmed and shot down by the French in cold blood. Their bodies were heaped up in a pyramid and left to consume. And then it's going to deal with Saint Jean d'Acre in Syria, the king of the north, which was to come against him like a whirlwind. So we don't have time to go into this right now. I might look at this a little bit tomorrow, just how they look at the response. But if we look at this history, what I want to see and what I think that we'll begin to recognize is that there is a parallel in Millerite history to an understanding that they have based upon current events that is partially correct and partially false. That is, obviously, this whole interpretation about Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45 is wrong, starting at verse 36. But they still get a lot of things right about the role of Islam because they understand Revelation chapter 9. And what that does is it blinds them a little bit to what's happening in their present situation. That is, they don't see where they are in the stream of time. And we're going to address the thing. We're going to go over, again, that issue dealing with, did they believe that the fall of the Ottoman Empire would mark the beginning of the close of probation? And we're going to see that that is the case. And why they saw that, even though they don't explicitly say it, we can see that it relates to their interpretation of Daniel chapter 11, verse 40 to 45. So it's just an underlying belief that if you don't know that they have, you wonder why they're saying that the close of probation is going to be occur when Turkey falls. But then we're also going to have to see in our history what were some of the weaknesses in, especially when it comes to Raphi and Panium, and in how we initially tried to interpret that this was a battle between the king of the north and the king of the south, and we were looking for Russia and the United States to be involved in a conflict. And we're gonna examine that and try to see, were we correct or were we wrong, or were we just wrong, or were we placing it, or is it still something that's future? Or if it is future, how should we understand that event? What would mark such an event? So there are a lot of things, there's a lot of irons in the fire here right now, a lot of different issues. And we're going to have to sort this out. I don't think we're going to get it all sorted out tomorrow. So it's going to take us a little bit of time before we get back into Jeff's understanding of the time of the end. And any final thoughts or questions before we close with prayer?
Well, Jeff didn't understand all this history either, did he?
Regarding how the Millerites understood Daniel 11? No.
Right. He didn't know about Lich's writings.
No, he didn't. From what I understand, he didn't. He knew about Josiah or about Uriah Smith's understanding, but I don't think he knew that it was also Josiah Lich's understanding. And any other thoughts? Anybody else?
Well, so Jeff was just following E.G. White.
Yes.
Yeah, not so much Uriah Smith.
Yeah, and also Jeff had read Lewis F. Weir, as we know, because he mentions him in his article. So Jeff was kind of in the same boat as I was, because I was reading Lewis F. Weir. I knew about the attack on Uriah Smith's view, but I didn't know that Uriah Smith's view was Lich's view until recently. So probably until Parminder mentioned it, but I've also been in with discussions on other people who are supporting Uriah Smith's view, and they brought up that it's Lich's view. So there's some discussions going on with other people regarding these very things we're studying, and this has been very, very helpful for me to really grasp the problems with Lich's view on Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45. So I hope people see that this is very helpful. To right now, examining this foundation is going to help us to sort through the present problems that we're facing in this movement. And we're going to see, as I said many times, that the foundation was laid correctly. That the problem wasn't the foundation. The problem was how we came to relate to current events. And really, in relating to current events the way that we did, we were in a sense denying some details in our foundation, or not seeing them clearly. Taking Ellen White's statement that we started out with, here today, where we have really a description of what is occurring now, but not in the way that Jeff would not have seen it in that manner, right? So he wouldn't have seen that that's really what was happening. Okay, so let's close with a word of prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we are very thankful for the time that we've had here this morning. We're thankful that you have been able to lead and guide in this study, to teach us many things, the things that you've been teaching me, Lord, sometimes been a bit hard to take, and I'm sure everyone else is experiencing that as well. We just ask, Lord, that you can be with us in our personal study, that your angels can watch over us, and that you can help us to reflect your character in all that we come in contact with. And we pray that as we progress in this study, that we will be able to see clearly the things that now are blurry or in darkness, and that these things will work upon our heart and bring us a stronger conviction to move forward along this path. And we thank you for hearing our prayer. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.